Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 164th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Richard Salsman. I'm a senior scholar for the Atlas Society. We're the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in creative ways like animated videos and graphic novels. Now, today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Professor Ray Niles. But before I introduce Ray, I want to remind those of you who are watching us on Zoom or are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, various other social media, you can use the comments section to type in your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can, possibly during the interview, but definitely at the end of the interview. So welcome all. And now to our guest. Ray Niles is a Ph.D. and a senior fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research, also currently teaching economics at St. John's University in New York. He earned his Ph.D. in economics from George Mason University in Virginia. He earlier than that earned his MBA in finance and economics from the Stern School of Business at NYU. Now, before embarking on his academic career, which is more recent, he worked for over 15 years on Wall Street as a senior equity research analyst at places like Citigroup, Schroders, and Goldman Sachs. He's a longtime objectivist. He's published numerous articles in scholarly and popular publications, including the Review of Austrian Economics, including the Objective Standard, on various issues related to economics, to internet policy, and to government regulation. And as to his first affiliation, I highly recommend that you go to aier.org and search for Ray Niles, Niles. He issues essays periodically. They're very good. They're very well done. They're very interesting. Ray, it's great to see you again. I know we've known each other for years. There's the full disclosure, but I really want to get into how you're doing, what you're doing. But, we normally start, because this audience really likes what we call origin stories. So the origin story idea is, how did you get to objectivism? How did you get to Ayn Rand's writings? How early, your initial reactions? We're really curious about that kind of origin.
Well, so I've been an objectivist, I would say it's over 4 decades.
Wow.
And it was really serendipity. I was in a used bookstore at age 13 and looking for something to read, and I saw Anthem on the shelf of a used bookstore. And I pulled it out, I looked at the cover, the man with the light bulb. It just intrigued me. And I was very interested. That was when I was reading a lot of sci-fi, some dystopian books like 1984, which scared the heck out of me.
Uh-huh.
And it really, it changed my life. I thought it was very profound, discovering the value of yourself, that you should live for yourself. And I immediately proceeded to read all of Ayn Rand's books. And it was funny, though, I was 13. So I said, well, I'm going to read her fiction first before the nonfiction, but I'm going to read it in the order that she wrote it.
Huh.
And the reason I said that, so I read We the Living, then Fountainhead, then Atlas Shrugged, after Anthem. I said, because I'll be older and more able to appreciate and understand Atlas, which I knew was a very important book, just as thick as it was. So I was about age 15 when I read Atlas. I declared to my parents that I was an atheist. I was raised Catholic, a lot of fireworks with regard to that.
Uh-huh.
And, the other thing, one little tidbit, you and I met, and I think it might have been 1985.
Right.
Yeah. So I went to the very first objectivist
in New York. It was in New York City, right? We were both in New York City.
Maybe it was. So
okay.
Maybe we have to talk about that, because I thought it might have been at the Thomas Jefferson School.
In La Jolla.
In La Jolla. So I went to the first two, the very first objectivist conference ever given. It was called the Thomas Jefferson School.
Right. Yeah.
Right a year after Ayn Rand had died, and I was all of 18 or 19. I was pretty young, and I thought I took all my savings to do this, and I thought I better go, because there may never be another conference like this.
Wow.
So I've got to go. So I found it very interesting, and so I've been an objectivist ever since. I found it very practical and helpful in my life.
One thing you're unique about is objectivism and economics. There aren't that many objectivist economists. Now, at the time, those conferences were run by George Reisman, right, who taught at Pepperdine for many years, and he knew both Rand and Mises, which is an
Yes.
interesting lineage, So having met the man who knew the two giants, Nort Buechner, I think, was another economist at the time, but there weren't that many. Maybe Hans Senholz, who given a lecture every once in a while. What were your initial impressions of Reisman? Because he eventually came out with that huge, great, wonderful book called Capitalism later. But he was lecturing at those conferences in the 80s.
Oh yeah, he organized them as well.
Yeah,
And my impression is, young kid, young adult, but I thought he was such a gracious man. That's sort of what really struck me. Just gracious, like it's just his bearing, very open and like a kind type person, like somebody you felt you could really talk with.
Right.
So I enjoyed how he ran the conferences, very, sort of punctual, and he had interesting guests. We had Edward Teller, the co-inventor of the hydrogen bomb, come and talk, and Peter Beckman, the physicist.
Yeah. Didn't he invite? I think he invited Walter Williams one year. Walter was great.
Yeah, I don't think I attended then. So Walter Williams was one of my professors at GMU.
At GMU, me too. Me too. We both had him. He was wonderful, wasn't he?
He's wonderful. Yep, a great professor, and enjoyed him very much. He was a funny guy too.
I mean, what I also remember about the Reisman lectures is they were the beginnings of the chapter of that great book. So we were getting it live, so to speak. We were getting it in real time, each summer. That was just wonderful. I'm just curious, Ray, going back to what you said earlier, atheism came up very soon. The fiction isn't overtly atheist. So how did you just kind of sense that that's what the philosophy was about, or were you questioning it separately? Because that's a big thing to break with a Catholic family, parents over that kind of thing. Did you get books, or was it part of your kind of sense of life?
It was a little bit part of my sense of life too. I was an altar boy, as I think you were, Richard. I believe you were.
I wasn't. You weren't. Okay. I was raised Catholic, but I didn't have the benefit of being an altar boy like you did. You've told me some collegial stories about the altar boys, which are just, I don't know if they should be off camera or not. Really hilarious.
Yeah. Well, I was never, nothing ever. I was never molested. Let me just.
Okay, good to know.
The experiences were pretty positive as far as being an altar boy. I was very young, but I was already having doubts about religion. Like age 12 or 13, I wrote a poem for my 8th grade student literature paper where I was kind of questioning the existence of God in a very mild way. Right. And then I don't know what clicked. I began reading her nonfiction probably at age 14 or 15. So sort of as I was reading the fiction, and I learned she was an atheist, and I felt it made me certain about being an atheist. Like, if I was having doubts, Ayn Rand gave me that certainty. And, I had a kind of a very traditional Catholic family, going to church every week. So it didn't go over well with my father, but, hey, that's another thing objectivism teaches, is the virtue of independence. And that was a lesson I definitely took to heart.
Wow, that's wonderful. Also, if you get the sense that, listen, I still have a morality here. It's not atheism is so tied up with, well, you must be an immoral monster. I mean, once people start realizing, no, I've got the morality here. I'm learning a secular morality. That helps.
Yeah, it gives a scientific basis for morality. It's scientific. I really like that a lot.
Now, I want to just hear, I know this, but the audience should really hear this. Why did you go to Wall Street? First of all, where'd you go to college, and what was your major? And then how did you get to Wall Street?
Yes, I was an economics major as an undergrad at the University of Florida, which is where I grew up. And, after business school, actually in business school, I didn't really know much about Wall Street. I had previously considered being a lawyer before that, and worked for a year or two as a paralegal just to check it out. And no regrets not becoming a lawyer. No regrets. But I discovered this field that's called equity research, where you analyze, stocks in an industry, and then you advise fund managers, hedge fund and mutual fund managers, on where to invest their money, and you specialize in a certain industry. I loved working on Wall Street. I'll have to say I really, really enjoyed it. It was very good while it was good. I mean, I did see some ugly things in my experience on Wall Street, and it's not not because, it's not a flaw of capitalism, but there, you find good and bad people in any field.
Yeah.
But also you see the effects of regulation. It's one of the most highly regulated industries in the economy. I mean, everything I wrote had to be read by an attorney. I got fingerprinted just to do my job. Like I'm a crook. They assume you're a crook at the outset.
Right.
The vast majority of people I met were really moral, good, honest people who, and there was something clean about the Wall Street environment where your goal was to make money, and it was people were unashamed of that, and it was I liked that environment.
Now on Wall Street, they, Ray, they call it the sell side, and then there's the buy side. And since the sell side is trying to distribute stocks and bonds and equities, they're often the analysts, not just the investment bank, are often charged with being non-objective. How did you handle that? Because here you are, you're coming in and you're becoming more and more of an objectivist, and it requires an objective, means of knowledge and things like that. Did you ever face any kind of problems with that where you couldn't be objective because you were underwriting the client?
Yeah, I did. And I, by the way, I mean, it's probably more than we can really talk about here, but the government, I'll just tell you very briefly, the government they intervened in Wall Street in the 70s. It was something they called it the Big Bang. And basically what they did is they stopped Wall Street firms from agreeing on a minimum commission for trading securities.
Right.
So it pushed the revenue Wall Street firms would get from trading securities way, way down, which meant that trading stocks was no longer much of a revenue generator for the firms. Instead, what became the big fee generator was investment banking, underwriting securities, offering new stock. So what that resulted in was a bullish bias among Wall Street firms. So I was an analyst. So the way I interpreted my job, was simply my job is to give a fair recommendation to my investors.
Yeah.
Now the thing is, in a bullish market, it's easy to be bullish on stocks, and it just the whole stock market's going up. But because they're so skewed towards underwriting securities, if you are bearish on a stock that is an underwriting client of the firms don't like it. And I had that experience. There was this industry that I covered, which was the electric utility and power generation industry, and I was the first bulge bracket or first analyst period to turn negative on power generation stocks. And unfortunately, my firm, didn't like it. And, they advised me to stop publishing, to change the titles of my reports.
Oh, wow.
It was very demoralizing to me, very demoralizing. But, I have a big, and ultimately it led me to go onto the buy side where I tried to manage my own money, which I did for a little while, where I had a small hedge fund I managed myself. But that's why I did it. So before, though, when companies didn't have that unbalanced incentives, if they made more money from trading, they would welcome correct bearish calls, because the trading clients of the firm, you're making money for them. So for example, when I made this bearish call, Fidelity sent a block of trades to our firm. They were really happy about it.
Yeah.
But it's like our firm says, oh, we made $100,000 from this or $1 million from this versus 50 million we could get from underwriting a new stock. Which won't happen anymore because Niles is bearish. But anyways, to make that long story very short, I was totally correct. In one case, there was a CEO of a firm who was very upset at my downgrade. He blamed me. I said, look, I'm the messenger. You're building too many power plants. The margins are collapsing. He lost his job. His firm went bankrupt. And I could give many more examples of that. But ultimately, the experience led me to look away from Wall Street, and I ended up in academics.
Having followed your career over the years, and you and I talked about, I know there are so many instances when you were under pressure and you performed so admirably, so objectively, and it wasn't always easy. But I like how you defend Wall Street generally. I mean, it does still pay for merit. And I don't know if you think that's changed over the years. Maybe it's changed over the years, but it is that kind of perform or else kind of place. So what do you say to a student who says finance is parasitical? The whole financial sector doesn't add value. Do you ever hear that? Do you ever hear that from students, or maybe even from other finance professionals?
I have.
They feel guilty.
Yeah, there's an infamous anecdote, and I think it's true. I think I looked into it. It was true. You may have heard the same thing. So there's this guy on Wall Street, and he traded an esoteric security. I forgot what it was, like, third world debt derivatives of a certain nature. And it's, the story is his 9-year-old daughter one day, they had to take her dad to work day, or take her daughter to work day,
Right.
and she said, "Daddy, what do you do?" And he's trying to explain it to her. He couldn't really do it. And then she's saying, "Well, what value do you provide?" And he couldn't answer it. He was unable to answer the value of his own profession. But now, to this guy's, I'd say, both his credit and his idiocy, so his moral integrity. This is on a Friday. He resigned his job on a Monday. He said, "I don't see the value that I'm providing. I have to resign my job."
Yeah.
But his idiocy, because if you understand the economics of finance, it's all value added. I mean, the simplest way to look at it, as you know, Richard, is anyone in finance, any aspect could be trading the most arcane security. You're redirecting capital to its highest valued use. You're moving money into the Steve Jobses of of the world and taking them away from that WeWorks guy. And it's a continuous process of reallocating capital to where it can create the most value. All of Wall Street serves that function. And it's sad that people aren't taught this in their finance classes, in their economics classes, in their philosophy classes. So anyone in finance, I mean, you can email me and ask me, but it's moral, it's good. Now, let me just say one quick thing. This firm I worked at, I guess I won't just say the name on this, but it was a large bank that also had an investment banking division. It's one of those 3 firms you mentioned. So, but as a bank, they effectively are subsidized by the Federal Reserve system. Now, back when I worked at Goldman, for example, it was a private investment partnership. So it didn't have that going on. Later on, that changed. This bank, which is the largest bank in the world at the time I worked for it, was getting a subsidy from the Federal Reserve, which meant that its cost of capital was artificially low, which meant that they could afford to do dumb deals. And they could afford to not listen to their analysts saying, don't invest further in this power generation industry. Don't underwrite more stocks in this industry. Advise your firms to pay off their debt because it's going through a downturn. And I found that I worked, like, comparing Goldman to this other firm, the quality of the bankers, when you had one firm getting this big subsidy from the Federal Reserve and this other not, the quality of the bankers with the firm with the subsidy was much lower, and they made worse investment decisions.
So subsidies, we often talk about finance being regulated, but maybe they're regulated because of what they call moral hazard, Ray, where they do reckless things because of these subsidies you mentioned. So what would these include, like deposit insurance or the too big to fail or discount window, those kind of things, discount window, liquidity bailouts, those kind of things are making them more reckless?
Absolutely. And it gives them a lower cost of capital. I saw this firsthand. I was involved in deals at both firms. And, the subsidized firm, for example, they would actually buy an equity offering by offering super low cost loan to the firm and said, we'll give you this low cost financing, basically subsidized by taxpayers through those 3 mechanisms you talk about, if you give us equity offering. When I was at Goldman, as an example, and I don't want to, Goldman has its own problems, but when I was at Goldman, they had a higher cost of capital. They couldn't do that because they had to pay a market price for capital. So they had to make better banking decisions. So a lot of the problems you hear about are due to government intervention and in Wall Street. A lot of the problems are like that.
So your experience on Wall Street, others of your peers, lots of smart, cerebral people, brainiacs, traders, FX, underwriting, capitalists as financiers versus capitalists as advocates of capitalism. What did you find? Were your peers mostly pro-capitalist ideologically? Were they mostly Republican? The standard view that the rich country club, they're all Republicans, they're all pro-cap. Did you find that amongst the rich folks you worked with on Wall Street, or did they lean left? Was there any kind of pattern you noticed politically?
Well, oddly enough, I never really talked about politics usually with my clients. So, but my guess is it ran the gamut. Even at a place like Goldman, you'll find, left left-wing, all across the spectrum. But generally we were just busy, making money, focused on helping to direct capital to its highest valued uses.
And now, I don't know if you have the experience I have had with students that were born, they were younger during the 08, 09 financial debacle and crisis and recession and all that. And they took an anti-capitalist view out of it. And remember, Occupy Wall Street, we have a question, in fact, one of our viewers here asked the question about what do you think about the Occupy Wall Street protests of 2010? That was in reaction to the Wall Street bailouts. What do you think caused that crisis, and what was your reaction to the government bailouts at the time?
Yeah, so it's an article I did write, and while I was still sort of winding down my Wall Street career. It's called 80 Years of Subsidies, and I talk about the causes of that 2008 financial crisis. Basically, the government has been subsidizing home purchases by subsidizing mortgages since the 1930s. And what happened is they ramped up the subsidies dramatically in the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. So, and it was a bipartisan thing, Democrats and Republicans, George Bush, Clinton, George Bush would say more Americans need to own homes. Well, let's just imagine that the people who have gotten mortgages already have a higher credit quality, a certain credit quality. How can you get more people to buy homes? The only way you could do it is to go to the deadbeat borrowers. Yeah. And they would do this by subsidizing mortgages to the point where you could buy a home for a $250 down payment, and then even $0. They were working in $0 down payment homes. So what the result of this was, this is the fundamental cause. People have written a lot, about the cause. This is the fundamental cause. The real price of homes. So the real price of homes, there's a chart you can find out there on the internet from 1890 to 1996, it's essentially unchanged. The real price of homes across America, except for a dip during the 1930s. Then from 1996 to 2006, the real price of homes doubled in one decade. That's not the market. That has nothing to do with the market. So what happened is, as the home prices went up, there were securities issued that were collateralized by the inflated value of homes and unsustainable value of homes. Now, there's other things that went on. Interest rates were pushed artificially low by Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, who even encouraged people to get these adjustable rate mortgages, which are great when interest rates are low, like the 1% short-term rates at that time. But then when rates go up, your mortgage payment goes up dramatically, and people begin to default on their mortgages. So it's a combination of these two things, with subsidies being the fundamental cause. And I look at those the interest rates as sort of the proximate cause of the crisis. But it made no sense for housing prices to double in 10 years. The Wall Street firms that got involved with this, they were sort of they only behaved this way because of the government artificially propping up the price of homes. It's 100% a government-created crisis. So the Occupy Wall Street people should read my article. They should study economics. Economics takes some effort. To actually understand things takes some effort, right? Rather than memorizing slogans, but unfortunately, this is what you and I are both professors, so we're there to help educate people, right?
But maybe they should have occupied Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the lobbies of those hybrid agencies. Remember, so much promote. I think, Ray, they call them subprime loans. Subprime means low quality. What in corporate life we would call junk bonds. Gee, what could possibly go wrong? They're promoting junk loans. Yeah. And so
then my brother, he was a lawyer at the time, and part of his practice was doing real estate deals. To his credit, well, what happened so one day he's at his desk, and his hairstylist comes in to his office, and she's going to buy a home. She's going to buy a home bigger than my brother's house. Now, he's a lawyer with his own practice. He's making a decent income. She was getting one of these practically $0 down payment loans with an adjustable rate mortgage. And my brother said, he's not an economist, but he's like, something isn't right here. And he sold that part of his practice right away. So he got out of it before the house of cards blew up.
Wow. I have a question on the side here. I'm looking at the chat and social media. Keep the questions coming in. They're really very good. I'm trying to get to the ones I can. Andrew Jackson famously was against the second bus, Ray, 1830s,
Yeah.
against, they didn't call it central banking then. Do you think the Fed should exist?
No,
Why?
no. In fact, well, part of the reason is I'll tell you. I just finished reading this book. I'll do a little plug because
Oh,
this man was a professor of mine at GMU, Lawrence H. White,
I love Lawrence,
and he's
Larry White. I love
you
him.
know him very well, Larry
Yeah,
White. You know
yeah,
him.
yeah.
He's the leading expert on free banking. So what banking would look like under laissez-faire,
Right.
and in the history of banking and gold-based banking. And actually, the reason I'm actually going to review this book for the review of Austrian economics.
Oh, great.
It's
Good.
going to be
And I
a few
know,
months.
and I noticed the subtitle is gold, fiat, and Bitcoin. So he's comparing and contrasting all three as
Yes,
monetary system. Okay.
yeah. So what's great about this particular book, which I could recommend a lot if anyone's interested in central banking or whether we need a central bank, he is comparing, like, if the government got out of the way, like imagine a laissez-faire world. Okay, first of all, we wouldn't have fiat banking because that means there would be no central bank, which is a government-run bank. So fiat banking just sort of falls by the wayside. It's inflationary, causes business cycles, all kinds of problems. So he's asking the question, given laissez-faire,
Yeah.
which would work better, which would emerge and be dominant, gold-based banking or Bitcoin-based banking?
Yeah.
And he really gets into the economics of it. And if you read that book, it definitely is. Even in discussing this issue, it's clear that we shouldn't have a central bank. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think though, but the base, so a banking system though, it doesn't have to necessarily be gold.
Yeah.
I think it should just be free. The banking contract should be free, and the base money that's at the root at the banking system, let the best money emerge. It could be gold, it could be Bitcoin. I mean, who knows?
Now back to that's great stuff. Yeah. Larry White is the best. I think I met him in the late 80s. He totally influenced me on free banking and the gold standard. He was
Yeah,
great.
and you've written a couple of good books, on the subject. Yeah.
Ray, I want to get now to the transition to academia, but let me learn about this. While you were in finance, I mean, Wall Street is I know what you did. That's a very intense, long hours, very intense, lots of travel. While you were doing that, were you also kind of self-educating on reading Austrian economics, Mises, Hayek, Schumpeter, the usual
Yeah.
crowd, maybe even Milton Friedman? Tell us about that, because people do juggle careers with, learning, and you don't always have to go to school for that. Were you reading stuff on the side, so to speak, while you were working on finance?
I did. It first of all was a very demanding job, as you know. I mean, I had to be at my office by 7:30 to 8 in the morning. Sometimes I'd wake up at 4 in the morning and write an article to be out to get to the lawyers by 6 a.m. to be, read before the market opens, and
Yeah.
traveling. I won't even know which cities sometimes I was traveling to. So I didn't have a lot of time for outside reading, but yes, I did. I read, you mentioned George Reisman, Friedrich Hayek, who's actually my favorite Austrian economist.
Okay.
And then, more recently, I didn't read till I was, right when I was transitioning into academics. I took a graduate course at Columbia in the history of economic thought when I was thinking about going into economics. And that's when I read Schumpeter, who's actually my favorite economist. But yes, to answer your question, yes, I did do a lot of reading. Now, when I really got to read these people in detail, though, was when I was at George Mason University getting my Ph.D. in economics, which is the leading Austrian economics graduate school in the world. I mean,
it is. So now, those who don't know, Joseph Schumpeter, if I remember his dates right, 1883, 1950. So an Austrian, but he also taught at Harvard, right? He was a Game to America, was very influential. Tell me why you like him so much. Tell me what his major contributions are.
Yeah, first of all, he's funny. He's actually, I like his style. It's a very big, grandiose style. He has, there's a lot of errors in his thought. So I'm someone, I just sort of pick and choose. I get, although Ayn Rand, I basically agree with essentially everything, but, I pick and choose. But what I like is he has the most, certainly it's the most original theory about business cycles among all economists.
That's quite a statement. That's quite a statement. Yeah, go ahead.
It is. So his book that really influenced me was written in 1911. It's called The Theory of Economic Development. It was actually written 1 year before Ludwig von Mises wrote The Theory of Money and Credit, where he first described the Austrian theory of the business cycle. They were classmates together at the University of Vienna.
Wow.
But what Schumpeter talks about is he was interested in progress, like what causes a rising standard of living. So, it's the same thing Adam Smith was concerned about, right? That was his full title of his book was about, the origin and nature or whatever of the, I forgot it now, but, rising standard of living, what causes it. Right. So what Schumpeter said is that, first of all, he said the motive driver of progress, now this is in 1911. This is also way before Ayn Rand wrote about this.
Right.
Was the entrepreneur.
The entrepreneur. So, the men of the entrepreneur. Wow.
So I call his theory the heroic theory of the business cycle.
Wow, very cool. Heroic. Yeah.
Yeah, where I talk about it that way because he really puts it on the shoulders of the entrepreneur, and he has a heroic vision of the entrepreneur. He said the entrepreneur, these are the people who break through obstacles. They have an original idea, a new idea. They create, to use Schumpeter's words, new economic space. New economic space. Think about it. It's like a new economic realm that never existed before, like Henry Ford with cars, right? Like Steve Jobs with the iPhone and smartphones. These didn't exist before. And he, computers, Intel with computers and Bill Gates with computers, it's expanding the economic world. Now, where he's interesting, he said, in the process of bringing these innovations to the market, the entrepreneur has a disturbing effect on the economy. First of all, if it's a big innovation, part of a big innovation, we can look back in history, like the railroad boom in the 1840s in England, like during the 1920s in America, which is a boom driven a lot by electricity-related industries, also chemical industries and things like that. Maybe in the more moderate, recently could say maybe the internet industry in the 1990s. But what happens is these big changes cause the creation of new financial capital as these entrepreneurs are bidding away the factors of production from their existing uses. So they're hiring workers, they're bidding up salaries, right? They're renting office space, they're bidding up rents, they're paying for steel, they're bidding up the price of steel. And a general boom occurs throughout the economy. But then what happens is, and he's well known for this term, we're probably about to say it, but creative destruction. That's his term, which he wrote about later on.
Famous term, What does that mean?
But what happens is that then there's a winnowing out of the winners from the losers, and that's when you have a recession. So what Schumpeter describes is a pattern in the economy where the secular trend is upward, but with these ups and downs as you go upward. And this actually pretty accurately describes every capitalist economy in the world. Now, the problem is they're all mixed economies, not purely capitalistic. And there are other causes of these booms and busts, like government inflation of the money supply, for example. So, but what's interesting is if you look at how people look at the boom and bust cycle, right? If we look at it, here's I could summarize very quickly how all economists look at it, okay? Left-wing kind of Keynesian economists, so real left-wing, a Marxist would say, look at those booms and busts. That's going to lead to the immiseration, the impoverishment of the worker, and that shows that capitalism is evil, right? Well, Marx was wrong, right? We got wealthier, even though we had booms and busts, right? And then Keynes said, well, those booms and busts are also, it's kind of an indictment of laissez-faire, so we can intervene like crazy with fiscal monetary policy and sort of try to smooth out the booms and busts. Then you had people on the right, okay, Milton Friedman, the Austrian economists, who said, those booms and busts are bad, but they're all due to government intervention. And if we have the right policy, maybe we can smooth out the booms and busts. And they're all across the board on this. So, you have like the monetarists say, well, Milton Friedman said, if you have a smooth upward rise in the money supply, the Austrians say, like, maybe Larry White, would say, if we just had pure free banking, it would smooth out the business cycle. Then you have some other people who claim to be pro-free market. They consider themselves part of the Austrian school, who actually want to intervene on the market because they say, yeah, the market is going to have these booms and busts, and it's due to fractional reserve banking. So we got to abolish that, have 100% reserve banking. But what's interesting is they all think the boom and bust is bad, right? It's harmful.
Right.
And they just differ, on whether it's inherent in capitalism. Some of them say that, or whether it can be controlled or not. Some of them disagree on that, but they all think it's a bad thing. Schumpeter says, hey, it's an unavoidable side effect of technological innovation, right? And he's the only guy who says that. So he's pro-capitalist. He's basically pro-laissez-faire. There's some people disagree about whether he is or not, but so this is what I'm writing about. This is what I floats my boat. I wrote part of my dissertation on it. That's the area that interests me.
This is a profound integration on your part to see Schumpeter's theory of the cycle and relate it to the wide gamut of other theories. That's really remarkable, Ray. And it sounds like the lesson you're learning, or the lesson he's teaching, is don't worry so much about business cycles, and don't just presume that boom bust means artificial. The whole creative destruction thing is something like automobiles replace horse and buggies, and the light bulb replaces candles, and that kind of, the telephone replaces letter writing. Right? It's not like all those products don't still exist. We still have horse and buggies in Central Park, but that's what he's talking about, right? Don't worry if there's cyclicality due to that, something like that. Yeah. And the promotion of the entrepreneur, I guess today they call them disruptors. Let me ask you about the transition. Let's get to this transition. How did this transition occur from finance to academia? Like, how did you go about thinking, you know what, I really want to be a professor? Because you are now, congratulations, for 4 or 5 years now more, professor of economics later in life. How'd that happen? How'd that work?
Well, there are two reasons. So I'll mention one. So I when I was winding down my Wall Street career, I wasn't sure what to do. And so I took a course. You could do this at Columbia University. You could take almost any course for credit, but as a non-degree student. It's a really nice thing. So I took a graduate course in the history of economic thought. The history of economic thought. Right. And it was like, it's one of my 2 favorite courses I ever took in economics, with the other one being my very first course as an undergrad. I mean, I adored the course. And I discovered Schumpeter in the course, and I wrote my term paper on Schumpeter. And then, so that was going on. Then, Richard, you're the other reason, because you got your PhD later in life, your PhD in political economy, and became a professor, which you are at Duke University. And so I kind of had that role model. There was also another fellow that we both know who unfortunately has died, John Lewis.
John Lewis,
same thing.
Yes, who was also in business for many decades. Yes, before he became a classical.
And objectivist as well. Yes, and he became a classical scholar.
I know.
So it's you and John, and I actually met and had dinner with both of you one time when I was thinking about this. You remember that?
Yeah.
And so then you two guys provided inspiration that it can be done, right? And then I went back and I had dinner with my professor after the course was over, this guy at Columbia University. And I said, I think I want to go into academics, but I'm older than your typical person. And he just looked at me and he said, Ray, some people are late bloomers.
Ray,
I said, do it.
When I was making the transition, and at, I don't know, age 47 or so, I needed a letter from my MBA professor from 3 decades earlier.
That's happened to me too. I did the same thing.
He thankfully remembered me and wrote a letter. But his favorite expression was, I don't know if this will work, Richard, you're too old to mold. And I said, what is that? I like the rhyme, but what does it mean? He said, no, we like young 22-year-old PhD students that we can mold and, make them automatons of us. Older means you're set in your views, and so if you can get over that and get over the bias that might be associated with late, as they call late bloomers. Well, I'm so glad you made this move, because I think you're very happy with it. You first taught Well, you got it at GMU. Was that hard? How long did it take? And how was the experience getting it at George Mason University in Fairfax? How'd that?
Yeah. So, well, yeah, I mean, I got accepted there and they gave me a little fellowship and whatnot.
Yeah.
But I finished my PhD in 5 years. Now, it was a little bit slower. I did get some course credit, as I imagine you did for my MBA. I did. But my wife, I'm happily married. I've been married now 11 or 12 years. But, we live in New York City and GMU's in Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
So almost every single weekend, I would go back to New York. I would generally take a bus. I didn't have a car. I'd never owned a car, actually. I drive, but I never owned a car. And so, I did that for like the 2 years of coursework. And, occasionally my wife, I'd be on, talking to her and, or FaceTiming, and she'd say, "Ray, you just look really tired. Stay in Virginia that weekend," and I would just, but, our marriage survived and I'm,
Yeah.
no regrets, because I'm very happy teaching. I'm very happy doing what I do. So no regrets, but I had a similar experience. It was tough getting a job immediately. So my advisor, a very well-known Austrian economist who I like very much, who's also my dissertation chairman, that's Peter Boettke.
Peter's great. Yes, Peter Boettke. He's great. He was helpful on the job front.
Yeah, he was. And so he said, "Ray, you just got to start working somewhere, even if it's further away." So for 2 years, I worked at DePauw, DEPAUW, a private liberal arts college, DePauw University in Indiana. And I was commuting every 2 weeks by plane to New York.
Wow.
And I did that for 2 years. So
Wow.
now I'm settled down in New York City. It's still trying to make it a permanent gig, but I'm hoping it'll turn out that way. It's a full-time gig, and I love it. I teach history, economic history. So I'm teaching economic history, and I'm teaching history of economic thought. So, economic history, and then also the history of economic development of economic ideas. And then I teach micro, macro, different courses like that.
Wow, that is a kind of a role model. But how do you do this late in life, and how do you get the jobs? And what if you are anchored geographically in some place and you have these other values? You have a beautiful, wonderful wife, I know, and family and all that. Well done, not easy. Also, going into it this late, it's almost like you're not going to get tenured. You're going to have to put together some contracts, right? A multi-year contract.
Yeah, I mean, I have a renewable 1-year contract. Yeah. At my university, there's actually for a decent chance I could convert it into a tenure track position.
Yeah, but, great.
But generally, it's funny about tenure is, my whole career, your whole career, there's no tenure out there in the non-academic world.
Yeah, it's actually on the decline, isn't it?
What's that?
It's actually on the decline as an institution, it seems.
Yeah, it is. And so, on Wall Street, you could be fired literally on a moment's notice. And if they fire you, they don't give you notice. They walk you out the door. Because you might have trade secrets and data.
I know.
I liked it. It was great. Yeah. That's why they pay you a lot of money too. You work your butt off, and maybe you get walked out the door. Hopefully, I don't know.
Now, Ray, Ayn Rand's 1967 book, Capitalism: The Unknown Ideal. Part of what she said was unknown, was its history. And I know you love economic history. Here's the question: do the students you deal with, or not just at St. John's but elsewhere, do they know economic history? Do they know the history of capitalism? What if they said to you, "Why do I care to know, what industrial production was in the late 1880s? Give me theory, give me ISLM curves, give me," what would you say? The importance of economic history?
Well, I think you have to. It's the evidence. Economic history is, if you're interested in understanding the economy, you need to understand economic theory. You need to understand economic history. I think it should be required for any economics degree. I think it should be offered by every history department at least as an optional course. Yeah. But now GMU, I don't know if they didn't mandate it, but they offered it. But it's your evidence. So, for example, the theory, you have different theories, right? Marx says capitalism results in poverty, right? Well, what happened? What's the history of capitalism show? It actually shows opposite. It shows a rising standard of living for everyone, for the so-called workers. right? The people
Yeah.
at the bottom as well as the people at the top, who are also workers, even though Marxists don't call them workers.
Yeah.
So I think it's you need to know the history of capitalism to understand our economy. The other thing you need to understand is when I look at the economy today, we have a mixed economy. It's a mixture of freedom and controls. So when I see things that seem to work well or that don't seem to work right, you can't just say, oh, that's capitalism, right? The way a leftist would. They just call what we have capitalism. No, it isn't. It's a mixed economy with capitalistic elements and socialistic elements. And if you study economic history, it helps you to tease that apart. You see what's contributing to the results we see out there in the economy.
I think these two interests of yours are very interesting. History of economic thought, from probably Smith, right, or the physiocrats, Smith, Malthus, Marx, up to Keynes, current day Samuelson, combined with the knowledge of the details, the empirics, is a nice combination, because these theorists should be looking at the world and saying, this is the way the world works. Why would they get it wrong? Let me ask you this, Ray. We've had now more than 100 years of, 25 or 30 quote unquote socialist experiments. And we still have famous people like AOC and others and Bernie Sanders and others pushing socialism, whether they call it Democrat. Why do people still want socialism? Or maybe younger students mostly, but what is that all about? Now that the record is in, so I bring it up because now that the economic history is in, we're not talking about loving it in 1916 before the Russian Revolution. We're talking about loving it in 2023. How do you explain that?
Yeah, our world with iPhones, jet travel, antibiotics, nuclear energy, everything else. It's a great question, and actually, this is where I think objectivism helps. Ayn Rand's ideas, because she talks about that, and she attributes it to the morality that people hold. And I think that understanding that people's moral beliefs really influence how their framework as to how they evaluate the world. It sets their framework as to what counts as important evidence, what does not, right? So, for example, a Marxist, there'll be an instance of a mean factory owner, who mistreated the workers, and he's all on that. That's the important fact, not the fact that over time the standard of living rose, the conditions of the workers got better, their lifespans increased, their health increased. That doesn't get focused on. Instead, that one thing gets focused on. Or, for example, this I'd say almost pathological focus on inequality. I've never understood this. A lesson I learned early on is not to envy what other people have, except that, maybe if they have something that I want, I can go out and earn it and buy it for myself, but not to say, oh, my life is miserable because someone else has a 120-foot yacht, or they fly around in a helicopter, whatever it is. So, the morality that Ayn Rand talks about is this morality of altruism. That the moral purpose of a person's life is to serve other people, and if that's the case, if anyone has more than another person, they should feel guilty about it and hand it all over to the person who's poor. Now, economics will tell you, if you try to do that in law through government policies, it will result in death, misery, destruction. Every communist state had famines, that tried to implement this, right? But so Ayn Rand has this idea. She says, the moral is the practical, right? It's certainly impractical to do that, but it's also immoral to do that. So the positive message you get from objectivism is that your life, my life, is of supreme value, and I have the right to soar. If I can soar like an eagle to the highest heights, like Steve Jobs, and become a multi-billionaire by selling all these products that benefit all these other people, I have every right to do it. And that the moral is the practical. That person's gain is not any harm to me, but it actually expands that economic space, to use Schumpeter's words, and we all are richer and are better off.
Yeah. Now, in introductory economics, this, I've seen this. What do you make of the standard textbook distinction you'll hear right up front? Well, there's positive economics, and then there's normative economics, and never the twain shall meet. the normative, the second one being the morality or the justice. What do you make of that? Is that a legitimate dichotomy, or is that a good way of splitting it?
I think it's a terrible idea. So the idea I use with my students, we talk about this, like especially my history of economic thought, but I'll talk about it in my regular intro micro class as well. And I say, think about a doctor, what a doctor does, right? Now, is a doctor indifferent towards the health of his patient? Does the doctor have to be indifferent towards the health of his patient in order to be objective and factual in how he does his work? No, the doctor has a normative goal, a normative interest, which is the health of his patient. The doctor is pursuing a moral goal, and that doesn't get in the way of being objective. So this positive, normative positive dichotomy, there are two roots to it. One root to it is that there's this fear that if you have a moral goal, you can't be objective about your work. So as an economist, we want to be objective. We want to be empirical. We want to be factual. So I'm not going to think about, any kind of moral goal in my work. I mean, at its extreme, it would mean like, I could equally work, for a dictator or for, the American president or whatever. But the other aspect of it is, is from a philosophical error, which stems from religion, actually, which is this idea that morality is arbitrary, that it's sort of made up. It's a matter of faith, right? And we're scientists. We don't want to be messing around with morality, which is the realm of religion and faith. So we're going to be positivists. So, Ayn Rand says that morality, you need a morality to live. It's an objective requirement of life. And you can know the right morality through an objective process, through a scientific process, a scientific philosophical process. So, I think of myself, so that doctor analogy is a good one, because I think of an economist as we're doctors. We're doctors concerned about the economic well-being of people in society. We want prosperity.
Right. I remember Reisman once said it should be as controversial for an economist to advocate capitalism and prosperity as for a doctor to advocate, health and nutrition. Like, why would that be controversial? Ray, we only have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go to some of the questions that have been submitted. Probably the shorter the answer, the better.
Sure.
So here's a good one. Does teaching the ideas or holding the ideas you have in university make you vulnerable to being canceled?
Yes. Well, I'll give it a simple one-word answer.
Yes. I mean, yeah. Now, okay. Here's another one. What do you think of the current state of the business cycle? Thinking we're on business cycles, how high interest rates will go. Your outlook for the U.S. economy and maybe just the U.S. Generally, intervention or not, pro-capitalism, anti-capitalism or not. What's your kind of outlook for the?
I don't have a specific viewpoint on where we are in the current cycle right now, which it's probably more your domain, Richard, with your professional work. But I'm not looking at the economy at that level.
Okay.
But as far as maybe a broader perspective, I'm bullish. I'm bullish.
Okay.
I'm bullish on economic growth, the world, and I think the right ideas. These ideas are getting out there, even though sometimes it doesn't seem like they are.
Yeah, and I noticed over your shoulder, is that Superabundance? That book is.
It is. Oh yeah.
I've talked about it recently. It's really a very optimistic take, isn't it, on creativity, entrepreneurship. I mean, even if policy is bad and the government's fiscally out of control, sounds like you're pretty high on what kind of entrepreneurial stuff's going on in tech and elsewhere, right? There's a lot of good news out there.
There is. I mean, new cancer treatments and AI, which I think is a good thing. I'm not afraid of it. This book, Superabundance, by the way, is something I really can recommend. It's a good work in economic history and the history of economic thought. But what's amazing, what these authors do is they look at historically up to the present, how much time of your work does it take to produce the money to buy a good. So for example, like a meal 150 years ago might have taken 4 hours of your labor.
Yeah.
Today it might take 10 minutes of your labor to pay for a meal. As an example, I mean, I'm not using those exact numbers.
Yeah.
it shows how dramatically our
Yeah.
standard of living has improved.
Yeah.
It's a good book.
Yeah, it's amazing the time price of things. It's a brilliant book. Martin Toupet, I think it's a Human Progress Project also over at Cato that he's associated with. Very good as well. Here's another one. Would you recommend that young students start with Ayn Rand's fiction or nonfiction?
That's kind of a nice question. I mean, I think I think you'd start with either. I've met people who come to Ayn Rand's ideas and they begin either way. I found the fiction really powerful. If you're, in a way, it's funny. I almost would say you're going to enjoy the fiction more the younger you are. It's just like, I find this in general. Like if I read Victor Hugo now, I wouldn't have the same experience as I did in my 20s when it just rocked my world. So, maybe that would tilt towards starting with a fiction, but I think you can go either way. Read Capitalism, No Known Ideal, read The Virtue of Selfishness. I know someone who got into objectivism through Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology.
Wow.
Which I wouldn't recommend as a first book unless you're
right. Now, you're a New York City guy for many, many years. Here's one. Could you explain for those who don't live in New York what these housing lotteries are? I don't know if we want to get in the weeds here, but I thought I would combine this with me noticing that 3 or 4 of your AIER essays are on housing. You seem very interested in housing, the economics of housing, how it could be messed up. Quick thoughts on housing in America, that sector, how it's treated in New York. I know you hate rent control. Why is housing interesting to you?
Well, part of it's because I live in New York City and I suffer. This is the most regulated, intervened in housing market in the country, which with the result that there's a real there's insufficient new housing being built every year. So the result is we pay the highest either rents or apartment prices in the country, sometimes in the world.
Yeah.
So I care as a New Yorker. Also, it's just I've decided I'm going to focus more attention in this area. Just I want to focus on something that and business cycles are kind of I'm going to focus on for now. I also learned there's a major lawsuit underway right now to try to get rent control declared unconstitutional. It's an amazing effort. I met with the lawyers involved in it. This is a very serious effort. It's led by the leading groups of apartment building owners, regulated apartment building owners in New York City. And their goal is to lose in the courts, meaning they're going to lose on the New York State level. They know they'll never they'll never win in New York State, and they want to get it up to the Supreme Court. I think just today, reply briefs were made on this, and so I find it inspirational. I want to do what I can by writing economic articles like I am on this topic.
I'm reminded in the chat also that we interviewed the author of Superabundance here at the Atlas Society, Martin Toupet. I believe our CEO, Jennifer Grossman, did that. So go to YouTube, Atlas Society, search for Superabundance. I do remember this now that I think about it. That was a great interview. Okay. Last question. I'm going to intervene here and ask the last question. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, something else? The future of objectivism, the objectivism movement, the spread of Ayn Rand's ideas. You've been in this 40 years. You have a perspective that few have, others have, Ray. What's your take on whether Ayn Rand's ideas are going to spread, take hold, in what ways? Any thoughts on that?
I think one thing to bear in mind, it doesn't take many people to move the world, right?
Yeah.
Like in terms of entrepreneurs, someone like Steve Jobs or someone of ideas, Ayn Rand, she was just one person and she's having the impact she's having. So I guess I will say I'm optimistic, although, I do think, people seem to be less conceptual, less thoughtful than they used to be. And, if people aren't conceptual thinkers, I think it's harder for them to they're not very good at thinking abstractly. I also think people's education levels have really sunk in terms of just knowing things like history, like, when did World War II happen? When did the Civil War happen? Things like that. Yeah. But, having said all that, I think I'm optimistic because, reality will win in the end. But, it might take many years. I don't think I'm going to live in a laissez-faire world in my lifetime. but I think I can live in a world where I can have a very good life. It's significantly free, and I think in the end the ideas will win over some long time frame.
I like that. She also said those who fight for these ideas live in it today. We're talking about it right now. I feel like I'm in a universe that's wonderful because I'm with Ray Niles talking about great ideas. That isn't that what we want? A world where there's a bunch of people like that. Yeah, I think also your insights on entrepreneurial. Someone in academia years ago told me, don't just be an academic, be an entrepreneurial academic. Start journals, go to conferences, stir the pot. So I think it's interesting, your interest in entrepreneurialism and your history of this. You combine that with academia, you can be an activist academic and still be a scholar, not a crazy person. That's how to do it. We have, unfortunately, Ray, we could do this for 3 hours, I think, run out of time. So I wanted to thank you very much for this. I enjoyed it a lot. I think the audience did. And I want to thank all of you who joined us today. If you enjoyed this video or any of our other materials, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at atlassociety.org. And also for next week, be sure to join our CEO, Jennifer Grossman, who will be speaking with British broadcaster and comedian Andrew Doyle, and that's on the next episode of the Atlas Society Asks. Professor Niles, Ray Niles, great to see you. Great to talk to you. Continued success in your remarkable, remarkable career.
Thank you, Richard. It was a real pleasure.
Okay.